Hello, and welcome to episode 38 of the Bible Q&A with Pastor Stephen. My name is Stephen Pace, and I'm the senior pastor at Decatur Bible Church in Decatur, Michigan. This podcast attempts to answer Bible questions in a clear but thorough manner. If you would like to have a Bible-related question considered for a future episode, you can email me your question to pastorstephendbc@gmail.com. Again, if you have a question related to the Bible, you can send me the question to pastorstephendbc@gmail.com. In this episode, we're going to be looking at one particular topic related to the flood as recorded in the book of Genesis. So let's grab our Bibles before we get started. So as we get started on this episode, once again, we'll be looking at the chronology of the flood as recorded in the book of Genesis chapter 7 through chapter 8. So get your Bibles out for that. And as we get started, I was asked a question recently and thought this would make for a good study and overview for this particular podcast. So we're going to look at the chronology of the flood. We'll cover sort of an overview of it, and then after we cover about halfway, we'll look at a Bible trivia question, and then we'll look at the second half of the chronology of the flood. So if you have your Bibles, you'll notice that we'll need to turn to Genesis, as I mentioned earlier, chapter 7, and I'll give you the general references for this as we go forward. But of course you have the context of the book of Genesis so far is you have the account of creation. So we have the account of creation in the first three chapters, with chapter 3 representing the fall of man. And then of course in chapter 4 you have the story there of Cain and Abel. And then following that, you see how it goes to the family of Cain. And then in chapter 5, the family of Adam. And then probably the more well-known chapter 6 with the wickedness and evil that is all covering the earth. And the Lord sees this great evil and decides that it's time for judgment. But he does see and give grace, favor to Noah. And so he gives Noah the instructions to prepare the ark, and we see that taking place and see that through chapter 6. But what we'll be looking at is what is the chronology again of the flood, and you can use this to sort of get a general idea, which hopefully will give you a good overview so that you'll have an understanding of this as you read through it, perhaps even visualize it maybe a little bit, what is happening. So let's begin. We know in Genesis chapter 7, verses 4 through 11, we see that in the 600th year of Noah, Noah entered into the ark. Now, we know that Noah brought in his family, his sons and his wife, and his sons' wives. They entered into the ark. And this was in, again, the 600th year of Noah. Of course, people lived longer during that time. But we do know that this occurred during the second month and on the 10th day. Then we know 7 days later that the rain began to fall. So what you have in Genesis chapter 7, verses 7 through 11, you have Noah entering into the ark with his family. So as we continue, what we'll find is in verse 12 of chapter 7, you'll see where the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So we see the time period that's going on there. So what we have is, again, in Genesis chapter 7, verses 7 through 11, Noah and his family enter into the ark. Then there's a 7-day, if you will, waiting period. And at the end of that period, the rain begins to fall. Then in verse 12, we see where the heavy rains, the storms, if you will, come, and they last 40 days and then 40 nights. Now, something worth noting here is, so we have 40 days, as I said, 40 nights, but I draw your attention to chapter 7, verse 24. Notice how it says the water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So what you have so far is you have Noah entering into the ark with his family. 7 days later, the rain begins to fall. You have a 40-day period where there are heavy rains that come and go. But then we also have, of course, this prevailing waters that come, and that lasts there 150 days. So if you think about it this way, he gets into the ark, there's a 7-day period where there's waiting, but then you have 150 days there, as we saw, for instance, in chapter 7, verse 12, as well as in chapter 7, verse 24. I'm going to read something to you. It comes from the MacArthur Study Bible, just hopefully to put this piece together here. It says that the waters flooded the earth for 150 days, 5 months of 30 days each, including the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. See Genesis chapter 7, verse 12, verse 17, verse 24, and lastly chapter 8, verse 1, plus the initial receding. So what we have there, again, is a period of time chronologically, and then finally the waters begin to recede, which is where we end up with Genesis chapter 8 in verses 3 through 4. So let's read those verses. So again, Genesis chapter 8, verses 3 through 4. And the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. So it begins to recede, if you will. Notice it says in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. So what we have so far in this first part is Noah entering into the ark. 7 days later, after waiting, the rain comes. And then what you have is water continuing for 150 days until finally what you have is the ark resting there at the mountain of Ararat. And if you want that spelling, that's Ararat. And we see that in Genesis chapter 8 and in verse 4. Now before we continue, let me take just a quick minute here. I'm going to read something to you from the Genesis record, which is a commentary from the late Henry Morris. And he makes this comment regarding the ark and it resting. And it's helpful here just as we get to this point in the chronology. He says, quote, "It is significant that the ark is said to have rested as though it had been laboring for 5 months in accomplishing its work of saving its occupants from sin and judgment." Interesting note there by Morris, because he focuses on the idea of it resting. And so what you see there is, and of course, the period of time, but he notices and he draws out the idea of perhaps it laboring. You imagine the cataclysmic judgment that has come upon the earth because of sin and rebellion against God and all of those things mentioned in Genesis 6. But as Morris mentions, the ark is seen as having labored. In other words, it wasn't an easy journey during this period of time, but the ark also served as its purpose, which is, of course, deliverance for those who are on the ark from judgment of sin. And I think Morris is helpful in us making sure that we note that as well. So in this first chronology, we see that before we move into part 2 of looking at the chronology of the flood, I'm going to ask you a trivia question. And the trivia question is this: is Ben Hur in the Bible or only in the movie? Let me repeat the question again. Is Ben Hur in the Bible or only in the movie? In order to answer this trivia question, we'll need to turn to 1 Kings chapter 4 and look at verses 7 through 8. So 1 Kings chapter 4 verses 7 through 8, and we know that King Solomon followed King David, where they were still the, if you will, united kingdom. The kingdom was not divided at this point. Solomon follows King David, and as he's being established, of course, as the king over all of Israel, one of the things he does in terms of what we might think of as administration, we see in verse 7, it reads, and I'm reading from the New American Standard, the 95 edition says, "And Solomon had 12 governors over all Israel, who provided for the king and his household. Each one made provision for 1 month of the year." So you can see there where Solomon has 12 governors, obviously 12 for each one for each of the months of the year. But notice verse 8, and they go in and name them. These are their names: Ben Hur in the mountains of Ephraim. So the answer to the question is Ben Hur in the Bible? And the answer would be yes, the name Ben Hur is in the Bible. Of course, there is the well-known movie about the individual named Ben Hur, but we do actually have the name is in the Bible itself as one of the 12 governors that Solomon established over Israel. Let me read this to you, this note from a commentator, and it helps clarify what in fact Solomon did here. In 1 Kings 4 it says, quote, "Solomon divided the land into 12 geographical districts, each supervised by a governor. Each month a different governor collected provisions in his district to supply the king and his staff." And as we saw in verse 8, the very first one is Ben Hur, the same name of the individual in which we have the well-known movie Ben Hur. So that's our answer to our trivia question for this episode. So now as we move into what I would call part 2, we're going to look at the second part of the flood chronology. Where we left off was the ark resting on Mountain Ararat, and that's in Genesis chapter 8 in verse 4. But as we continue, we know the waters continued to recede, and then the tops of the mountains become visible once again. So clearly you can see the catastrophic nature of the flood and just how long it takes for the water to recede. So just imagine the mountains, sometime looking out at them, imagining them having been covered for that long, and that period of time needed in order for them to become visible again. You can find this in Genesis chapter 8 in verse 5. It says, "And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen." And you can see here as well, if you notice as we go through this, that Moses, when he records this, is very specific. He's very detailed. These aren't vague periods of time, but in fact is very specific on when these occur, oftentimes noting the first day of the month, for example. Now as we keep going here, we know the waters are receding here. And then 40 days later, we know a raven was sent out, and then a dove sent out and returned. You see that in Genesis chapter 8, verses 6 through 9. But then we have 7 days later that a dove is sent out, and then he returns with a leaf. So that's Genesis chapter 8 and verse 10. So we're looking at the month being the 11th month, and this is day 18. So they are obviously on the boat there, the ark, for quite a substantial period of time. But I want us to look at this one in chapter 8 and verse 12, because Noah has been sending out the raven and then a dove. He sends the dove out and returns with a leaf, but in this case things change. Notice verse 12. So he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, which did not return again to him any more. So again, notice just how long it's taking for the flood waters to recede. So quite a cataclysmic, obvious judgment here by the Lord. Now as we continue, we see in chapter 8 and verse 13, as we come towards the latter part here of the chronology of the flood, you see where it says, "And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry." So just consider, when we started in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 4, we know that it was the 600th year of Noah in the second month and 10th day. So this is quite a long period of time, again, just to imagine not only the consequences of the flood, but also how long it takes for it to completely subside. Now, so we know that the land is dry. Noah sees it, but then we see that the land being completely dry, Noah would exit the ark, and you can find this by reading where we left off, verse 14 through verse 19. Now, having given a general overview of the chronology of the flood, I would encourage you, before we finish, sometime to read verses 20 through 22 of Genesis chapter 8. We see that once Noah has been delivered from this cataclysmic judgment, you see where he builds an altar to the Lord. The Lord has faithfully delivered him through, and of course his family as well, but has delivered him through such a cataclysmic judgment that has come upon all of creation, in terms of the earth, that is. And he offers this burnt offering, and then in verse 21, the Lord is pleased with what he has given, meaning through the sacrifice there. But it's fascinating to see the ending, which is that the Lord promises to never do this again. He would never flood the earth in such a global catastrophic flood again. Now, this of course doesn't mean that God won't judge the earth again. We know in, for example, 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 3 through 10 that the Lord will still bring judgment on the earth in the future. But the Lord is so gracious here, accepting the sacrifice of Noah, but also his grace in promising not to, if you will, do this judgment again, this type of cataclysmic flood. Well, that concludes episode 38. I pray that this has been helpful and a refresher, or if you've ever been confused by trying to get an overview of the flood, hopefully, Lord willing, that will help clarify some of the chronology. If you are interested in the study of it a little bit more, a couple of resources that I could suggest to you. Again, Henry Morris has a book entitled The Genesis Record. It's a commentary on the book of Genesis. He does really well with it. There are also resources that give charts on this if you're a chart type of person. The Bible Knowledge Commentary has a helpful chronology of the flood. You can also find one as well in the MacArthur Study Bible. He has one. It's somewhat similar to that Bible Knowledge Commentary one, but both very helpful if you want a chart. So encourage you to look at those should you want to inquire any more about that subject. Well, thank you for taking time to listen, and until next time, God bless.